He had no name that the chronicles bothered to keep. He was one of perhaps 800 Spanish and Maltese soldiers crammed into a small, star-shaped fort called Saint Elmo on the northern tip of an island most of Europe had already written off. On the morning of June 23, 1565, after 31 days of continuous bombardment, he was still at his post on the Cavalier, the raised gun platform, firing into the smoke. By nightfall, he would be dead, and so would nearly every man around him. Of the entire garrison of St. Elmo, fewer than 10 would survive to tell what happened inside those walls. That ratio is the thing that should stop you, not the famous numbers everyone repeats, not 500 knights against 40,000 Ottomans. The number that almost no one talks about is the survival rate. Across the whole 4-month siege of Malta in 1565, roughly 9 out of every 10 of the defenders who held the inner forts did not walk out the way they walked in. They died at the wall, or they died in the water, or they died in beds from wounds that turned black. This was not a battle that produced veterans. It produced a graveyard with a flag still flying over it. So how does a defending force lose 90% of its men and still be remembered as the side that won? And why did the men who knew the odds, who watched Saint Elmo burn for a month, choose to stay anyway? Here is what I am going to walk you through. First, the exact arithmetic of the slaughter at Saint Elmo, the small fort that was supposed to fall in 5 days and instead held for 31. And the precise reason its defenders were sentenced to die before the first cannon fired. Second, the single tactical decision by the Ottoman commander that turned a quick conquest into a meat grinder that consumed his own army faster than it consumed the Christians. Third, the brutal mechanism of how men actually died in this siege, which was almost never the clean death of a musket ball, and why the sick and the wounded mattered more to the outcome than the soldiers still standing. Fourth, the 3 moments where the entire campaign turned on a single human choice, and the one of those 3 that almost no popular account gets right. And fifth, the cold final ledger, the body count on both sides that explains why the Ottoman Empire, the most powerful military force on earth, never tried to take this rock again. Before any of that, one thing I want to be clear about. Much of what we know about Malta comes from a handful of eyewitnesses. Men like the Italian soldier Francesco Balbi di Correggio, who was actually inside the walls and kept a diary, and from official Ottoman and Hospitaller correspondence. Balbi was not a knight. He was a 60-year-old arquebusier, an ordinary gunner serving in a Spanish company, and that is precisely what makes his accounts so valuable. He recorded the things the official dispatches left out, the price of bread as the siege wore on, the names of the men who manned each post, the smell of the harbour when the dead floated in it. He published his diary in 1567, only 2 years after the events, while the survivors could still contradict him if he lied. Set against him, you have the Ottoman side, which is thinner because the Ottoman chronicles tended to record victories more carefully than defeats, and Malta was not a victory. So most of the precise numbers we have come from the Christian side, and that is a bias you should hold in your mind for the entire story. Where the numbers are disputed, and many of them are, I will tell you. The survival figures here are drawn from those period accounts and the work of later historians, men like Ernle Bradford in the 20th century who reconciled the contradictory sources, treat the precise percentages as the best surviving estimates of a chaos that no one fully counted at the time. No clerk stood at the breach with a ledger. The figures are reconstructions of slaughter, not an audit of it. Now, the island itself. Malta in 1565 was a sun-bleached limestone slab roughly 17 miles long and 9 wide, with almost no trees, almost no fresh water in summer, and soil so thin that defenders later scraped earth from cemeteries to fill their gabions, the wicker baskets they packed with dirt to stop cannon shot. That detail tells you everything about the place. There was so little soil on the bare rock that men had to dig up their own graveyards to build the walls that would create new graves. The island sat in the dead center of the Mediterranean, 60 miles south of Sicily and about 200 miles north of the African coast, which is exactly why it mattered. Whoever held Malta held a knife at the throat of every shipping lane in the Central Sea, the grain routes, the pilgrim routes, the trade between the Ottoman ports of the east and the Barbary states of the west. For the Ottoman Empire under Suleiman the Magnificent, then in his 70s and at the height of a reign that had already lasted 45 years, the island was an irritant. It was occupied by the Knights of St. John, the Hospitallers, a religious military order that Suleiman had already beaten once. 43 years earlier, in 1522, he had thrown them off the island of Rhodes after a siege that lasted nearly half a year and cost him dearly. He had let them leave with honour, marching out with their banners and their weapons, and that mercy had been a mistake he was now living to regret. They had drifted across the Mediterranean for 7 years, landless and homeless, a fighting order with nowhere to fight from, until in 1530, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V handed them Malta for the rent of 1 Maltese falcon a year, payable each All Souls' Day. And from Malta, they had gone back to doing the one thing the order did best, which was raiding Muslim shipping and selling the crews into slavery. By 1565, the Knights' galleys and their corsair allies had become genuinely expensive to the Ottoman economy. The breaking point, the thing the sources point to, was the order's capture of a great merchant galleon belonging to the chief eunuch of Suleiman's harem, a ship loaded with goods worth a fortune. The order had also taken to seizing ships carrying pilgrims to Mecca, an insult that was religious as much as financial. So Suleiman assembled one of the largest amphibious expeditions of the century. The figures vary by source, but the Ottoman force that arrived off Malta in the 3rd week of May numbered somewhere between 30,000 and 40,000 fighting men, including several thousand of the elite janissaries, the Sultan's professional infantry, and corps of religious volunteers, the Yaylas, who fought half-naked and on drugs to feel no fear. They were carried in roughly 200 ships. Against them stood the defence, and this is where the first hard number lands. The Grand Master of the Order, a Frenchman named Jean Parisot de Valette, then around 70 years old and himself a survivor of the Rhodes siege 4 decades earlier, could field perhaps 500 Knights of the Order, supported by something like 1,500 Spanish and Italian professional soldiers and several thousand armed Maltese militia and galley slaves pressed into the works. The most generous count of trained, equipped defenders is around 6,000. The most quoted figure of frontline professionals is closer to 2,000. Either way, the attackers outnumbered them somewhere between 5 and 8 to 1, and the attackers had brought the heaviest siege artillery in the world, including basilisks that could throw stone balls weighing over 160 pounds, and a monstrous gun that fired marble shot of around 200 pounds at the walls. Valette did something with that disadvantage that looks insane on a map and was, in fact, the coldest piece of reasoning in the entire campaign. He did not try to hold the whole island. He could not. To stretch his 2,000 professionals across 17 miles of coast would have meant being strong nowhere. So he pulled everything that mattered into a small cluster of fortifications around the Grand Harbour, one of the finest natural anchorages in the Mediterranean. 2 peninsulas, Burgu and Senglia, side by side and joined at their landward ends, held the towns, the Order's hospital, the Grand Master's residence, and the bulk of the Knights. He chained the 2 peninsulas together across the water between them so that no enemy galley could slip in and divide them. And guarding the mouth of the harbour, on its own separate point across the water, sat Fort Saint Elmo. Small, star-shaped, with 4 points and a detached outwork called a ravelin. Newly built, finished only a few years before, and badly sited, overlooked by the higher ground of Mount Sciberras that rose directly behind it. Saint Elmo controlled the entrance to the anchorages the Ottoman fleet needed for shelter from the open sea, so the Ottomans decided to take it first, reasoning that with the harbour mouth secured, their fleet could ride safely at anchor while the army reduced the main forts at leisure. They expected it to fall in 3 to 5 days. It held for 31. To understand what those 31 days actually were, you have to understand what the defenders of Saint Elmo knew about their own situation. Within the first week, it became obvious to everyone inside the fort that it could not be saved. The Ottoman engineers had hauled their batteries up onto the heights of Mount Sciberras, the ridge that loomed directly over the little star fort, and from there they poured fire down into it day and night. They mounted, by the eyewitness counts, some 10 to 14 large guns on the ridge, and they did not fire in volleys with pauses between, but in a rolling, continuous bombardment. Balbi and the other eyewitnesses describe it as so constant that men inside the fort could not hear one another speak even when shouting. That the noise rolled across the water to Burgu day after day without stopping. And that the people in the main towns could follow the fate of Saint Elmo simply by listening. The walls, never strong and built of the same soft local limestone that shatters into flying splinters when struck, began to crumble within days. The defenders worked through the nights to repack the breaches with earth and rubble and timber, and the Ottoman guns tore them open again by noon. Saint Elmo was, in plain military terms, a death sentence with a roof. And the men inside knew it. There was a moment early in the siege when a group of knights in Saint Elmo sent a message across the harbour to Valette begging to be allowed to abandon the indefensible fort and die instead in a sortie, sword in hand, in the open, rather than be slowly ground to paste under guns they could not reach or answer. Valette's answer is one of the most ruthless command decisions in military history, and it is the first of the 3 human turning points I promised you. He refused. He sent a commission of his own knights across to inspect the fort, and when some of them agreed the place was hopeless, he simply replaced the men who wanted to leave with men who would stay. He told the garrison, in effect, that Saint Elmo had to hold, not because it could be saved, but because every day it survived was a day the Ottoman army bled and the Ottoman summer shortened. He reportedly offered to come and die in the fort himself, an old man of 70 taking up a pike at the breach, and offered to send fresh volunteers to replace any man who wished to withdraw. The shame of that offer did its work. No one left. Each night, as long as a single rowboat could still slip across the harbour in the dark, under the noses of the Ottoman guns, volunteers crossed the water into the burning fort, carrying powder and bread and fresh men in, and bringing the worst of the wounded out. They were crossing, knowing precisely what waited for them. They were not crossing to win. They were crossing to spend their lives slowly enough to be worth something. That is the mechanism at the heart of this siege, and it is the part the famous numbers hide. Valette was not trading lives for territory. He was trading the lives of Saint Elmo's garrison against the calendar. A 16th century army of 40,000 men camped on a waterless island in the Mediterranean summer was a clock running down, and Valette could read the clock better than Mustafa Pasha could. Consider what such an army needed simply to exist. Tens of thousands of men and their animals required water that Malta in July did not have. The Ottomans had to ration it and haul it, and Valette had ordered the island's wells poisoned or fouled with dung and bitter herbs and dead animals before the enemy arrived, so that the very ground refused them. Every week the Ottomans spent reducing one small fort was a week of dysentery spreading through their crowded camp. A week of provisions burned through that had to be replaced by convoys from 1,000 miles away. A week of food spoiling in the heat. A week closer to the autumn equinox storms that would force a fleet of 200 wooden ships to leave the exposed anchorage or risk being wrecked on a lee shore. The Ottoman fleet could not safely stay past mid-September. Every day Saint Elmo held was a day subtracted from the campaigning season the empire had to work with. The garrison of Saint Elmo was not defending a fort. They were defending time, and time was the one weapon Valette had that the Ottomans could not bombard into rubble. Now let me tell you how those men actually died, because this is where the clean image of a battle falls apart. We imagine sieges as duels of cannon and swords, of brave men cut down in the breach. The reality of Malta was filth, infection, and exhaustion. The single largest killer in a siege like this was not the enemy soldier at all. It was the wound that did not kill cleanly. A man struck by a stone splinter, by a fragment of his own shattered wall driven into him like shrapnel, or slashed in a night assault, would be carried to the hospital that the order ran with real skill for the age. The Hospitallers had begun their existence centuries earlier as literal hospital keepers in Jerusalem, and even on Malta they kept silver plate for the sick and rules about clean linen that were advanced for the 16th century. And then, days later, despite all of it, the wound would suppurate. There were no antibiotics, no understanding of bacteria, no concept of why a clean cut killed a strong man a week after he should have recovered. Gangrene, what the period called the mortification of the flesh, the slow rot of living tissue, killed men who had survived the actual fighting by a week. Sepsis, the infection moving into the blood, killed them with fever and delirium. The bloody flux, dysentery, killed defender and attacker alike, spread through water and waste in the cramped, baking forts where there was nowhere to put the filth of thousands of men. Heatstroke killed men encased in 40 to 60 pounds of steel armor under a Maltese July sun that pushes past 90 degrees. Thirst weakened everyone, slowed every swordarm, made every wound more likely to turn. This is why I told you the sick and the wounded mattered more than the men still on their feet. In a fight where the defenders had no reserves to speak of, every man who went down was, in practice, gone for good. And worse than gone, because a wounded man still consumed water, still needed tending by hands that should have been on the wall, still took up a bed and a nurse. There were no replacements coming from across the sea. Not yet. So the casualty rate did not just thin the line, it hollowed it out from the inside. The defense was a fixed sum of men that could only ever decrease. By the final assaults on Saint Elmo, the defenders were a small corps of barely standing men, some too wounded to walk, who had themselves carried to the breaches and propped in chairs with pikes and pistols laid across their knees because they could no longer hold a fighting position any other way. They had a chapel bell rung and took the sacrament together on the last night, knowing there would be no mourning for them. When the fort finally fell on the morning of June 23rd, the day of Corpus Christi, the Ottomans came over the rubble and found defenders who had to be killed where they sat. Men who could not rise to run even if they had wanted to. And here is the second great turning point, the Ottoman decision that turned victory into self-inflicted disaster. The Ottoman command was split between two leaders who did not trust each other, a divided command that is one of the oldest ways an army defeats itself. Mustafa Pasha, an aggressive and experienced soldier in his 60s who had fought at the order's expulsion from Rhodes, led the army on land. Piali Pasha, a younger man married into the imperial family and answerable for the fleet, commanded the ships and wanted them sheltered above all, because to lose the Sultan's fleet was to lose his own head. It was the need for that safe anchorage, Piali's anchorage, that drove the obsession with taking Saint Elmo first, instead of throwing the full weight of the army straight against the main forts at Burgu and Sanglia, where the war would actually be decided. They let the smallest, least important fort dictate the shape of the entire campaign. They spent 31 days and, by the most cited estimates, somewhere between 4,000 and 8,000 of their own men, including the legendary corsair Admiral Dragut, Turgut Reis, the most feared seaman in the Mediterranean, who was mortally wounded by a splinter of his own rock at Saint Elmo and died as the fort fell. They paid all of that to capture a heap of rubble that, once taken, gave them very little but a place to anchor and a long ridge of fresh graves. Mustafa Pasha himself, surveying the wreckage of Saint Elmo and the appalling cost of taking it, is said to have looked across the harbour at the far larger forts still standing and remarked that if the small son had cost so much, what would the father cost? The father was the main fortress complex of Birgu and Senglia. He had just spent more than a third of the campaigning season and several thousand irreplaceable men on the doorstep, and the house itself was still locked. What the Ottomans did next made it worse, and this is the turning point most popular accounts get wrong. The story you usually hear is one of pure, spontaneous cruelty. After Saint Elmo fell, the bodies of several captured knights were mutilated, their hearts cut out, decapitated, and their headless torsos nailed to crucifix-shaped boards and floated across the harbour to drift toward the main forts on the morning tide as a message of terror. That part is in the sources, and it was a deliberate act, not a frenzy. But the framing that it was simply barbarism misses the cold logic and the catastrophic blunder underneath it. It was psychological warfare, meant to break the defenders' will at Birgu before the real assault ever began. To make the men on those walls imagine their own bodies drifting on those boards and decide the fight was not worth it. Instead, Valette read the move for exactly what it was and answered in kind and harder. He had his Ottoman prisoners beheaded, and he had their heads loaded into his cannon and fired from the ramparts of St. Angelo back into the Ottoman lines. The message he sent was not fear. It was that there would be no surrender, no quarter, no mercy asked or given by anyone on either side, and therefore no easy victory anywhere on this island. He had just told an army already short on time and water and patience that every remaining yard would cost them what Saint Elmo had cost, that there was no negotiated way out of this for them, only the slow arithmetic of assault after assault. From a force racing the calendar, that was a strategic gift handed to the defenders. The terror weapon backfired into a guarantee of grinding total war. And total war was precisely the war Valette wanted. Because it was the only war the calendar would let him win. And grind it did. Through July and August, the Ottomans turned their full fury on Birgu and Senglia. There was a great amphibious assault across the harbour against the point of Senglia, an attack by boats packed with janissaries meant to come at the peninsula from the seaward side where the walls were weakest. The defenders had foreseen exactly this and had built a hidden shore battery, masked guns set low at the waterline, and when the boats were jammed together at close range in the shallows, they opened fire into the packed mass at point-blank distance, smashing the boats to splinters and drowning hundreds of armoured men in the harbour in minutes. The water, the chroniclers wrote, turned red and was thick with bodies and broken timber. There were mines tunnelled deep under the walls by sappers, and great wheeled siege towers rolled up against the ramparts. And the defenders answered with countermines dug to intercept them, and with desperate sorties at night to set fire to the towers and spike them. There was a moment when a breach at Birgu was so wide and the assault so overwhelming that Valette's own officers wanted to fall back into the inner fort of St. Angelo and abandon the town. And Valette, the 70-year-old Grand Master, seized a pike and went into the breach himself, refusing to retreat one step, and shaming the entire garrison into holding ground that by every rational measure should have been lost. There were days when the Ottomans came on in wave after wave for hours, and the breaches were held by men who simply would not step back, who fought until they dropped and were replaced by the wounded and the old, And through all of it, the Maltese civilians, the people whose island this actually was, fought and died alongside the order. They carried powder to the guns under fire, repaired the walls by night with their bare hands, the women and children hauling baskets of earth, and they were slaughtered in their thousands in the open villages and the old capital Medina's surrounding country that the Ottomans overran. The famous 500 knights were the spearhead, the steel tip of the defense, but the body of it was Maltese and Spanish, and they died in numbers that the legend, fixed on the aristocratic knights, tends to forget entirely. Which brings me to the third turning point, and it is not a heroic charge or a defiant old man in a breach. It is the thing the entire defense had been buying with all that blood from the first day. Time. And what time finally delivered. Across the water in Sicily, the Spanish viceroy, Don Garcia de Toledo, had a relief force assembling and spent the whole summer agonizing over whether to risk it. And his hesitation, which looks like cowardice from inside the besieged forts, was its own cold calculation. If his fleet were caught at sea by Pioli's larger fleet, or lost in a storm, then not only Malta, but Sicily and the coast of Italy itself would lie open to the Ottomans, and he would have thrown away the only naval force standing between the empire and the soft underbelly of Christian Europe. He was, in his own way, doing what Valette was doing, weighing a certain present sacrifice against a larger future. So he waited and waited, gathering ships and men, while Malta bled and Valette's letters grew more desperate. Finally, in early September, after nearly 4 months of siege, a relief force of somewhere around 8,000 men, the Gran Soccorso, the Great Relief, was landed on the northern coast of the island under cover of mist and got ashore intact. The effect was psychological as much as military. The Ottoman army, by then sick with dysentery, burned brown and exhausted, demoralized by an entire summer of failure, and dangerously low on food and powder, with the storm season already closing the window on their fleet, heard wildly inflated rumors of the relief force's size and lost its nerve. They had begun re-embarking their guns. They attempted a final, disorganized stand against the fresh Spanish and Italian troops, were beaten in the open field where they had no walls to hide behind and no will left to fight, and broke. On September 11th and 12th, 1565, the Ottoman fleet weighed anchor and pulled away from Malta for the last time. The siege was over. Now the cold final ledger I promised you, because the numbers are the whole story, and the story they tell is not the one the word victory usually implies. Of the defenders inside the inner forts, the professional corps and the knights, the proportion killed or permanently maimed reached, by period estimates, somewhere around 90%. The order itself lost roughly a third of its knights dead outright, with most of the survivors carrying wounds. Some counts put it at around 250 knights killed of the 500 who began. Of the original garrison of Saint Elmo, fewer than 10 men, and by some accounts only a handful of Maltese soldiers who threw themselves into the sea and swam across the harbour under fire, escaped its fall alive. Total Christian dead, soldiers and civilians together, ran into the thousands, with some estimates placing defender and inhabitant losses well above a third of everyone on the island who had been alive in May. The towns of Birgu and Senglia were reduced to rubble heaps, barely recognizable as places men had lived. This was survival in name only. The people who held Malta, in the main, did not come home to enjoy what they had held. They became the ground that was held. And the Ottomans, this is the part that explains everything that came after. The most powerful military empire on earth. The empire that fielded the best artillery, the most disciplined infantry, and the largest fleet in the world, attacking with somewhere near 40,000 men, is estimated by many historians to have lost between a third and a half of its entire force, with figures commonly cited around 10,000 to as many as 20,000 or more dead. and crucially, many of them not to swords and pikes at all, but to disease, heat, thirst, and the simple grinding attrition of 4 months stranded on a waterless rock far from home. They sailed away having taken Saint Elmo and a few outer positions, and nothing that decided anything. Nothing worth the price. Suleiman the Magnificent, the conqueror who, in his long reign had taken Belgrade, had thrown these same knights off Rhodes, had crushed the Hungarians at Mohacs, and pushed the empire to the gates of Vienna, received the news of the failure with a fury the court remembered, and reportedly swore that he would return the next spring at the head of the army in person to take the island himself. He never did. He marched instead against Hungary the following year, 1566, and died there in his tent during the siege of Sigurdsvar, an old man on one last campaign. The Ottoman Empire, which would go on expanding and fighting for another century and more, never again seriously attempted to take Malta. The little limestone rock that was supposed to fall in 5 days became the place the tide of Ottoman expansion in the central Mediterranean finally stopped. That is why a defense that lost 9 of every 10 of its men is remembered correctly as a victory. The Let understood something that the body count, read naively, hides completely. He was never going to outfight the Ottoman Empire. No force he could assemble could beat that army in open battle, and he knew it from the first sail on the horizon. So he did not try. He set out instead to make the empire pay a price for Malta that was higher than Malta was worth, and to make them pay it slowly, dragged out across the whole length of the summer, until the calendar and the disease and the storms and the thirst did to the Ottoman army what his outnumbered swords never could. Saint Elmo was not a fort he failed to save. It was 31 days of attrition he purchased at the deliberate price of nearly everyone inside it, 31 days subtracted from the enemy's clock and added to his own. The nameless man on the cavalier I started with, firing into the smoke on the last morning of his life, was not a martyr to a lost cause that happened to turn out well. He was a coin knowingly spent in the most expensive transaction of the 16th century, and the empire that was forced to spend its own treasure to match him never recovered the appetite to try the bargain again. If you want to go deeper than I could fit here, I have put together a free companion to this episode called the Malta Siege Field Map. It is a clean, illustrated breakdown that walks the whole campaign in sequence. A labelled map of every fort and the Ottoman battery positions on Mount Skiberas. A day-by-day timeline of the 31 days of Saint Elmo. A side-by-side of the disputed casualty estimates with the sources each one comes from. And a short reading list of the eyewitness accounts, including Balbi's diary, if you want to read the men who were actually there. It is completely free, there is no upsell, and the link is in the description below. If this account held you to the end, the single most useful thing you can do is hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Every subscriber tells the algorithm to put these forgotten campaigns in front of one more person who would never otherwise hear them, and that is the whole reason this channel can keep telling them. The next episode walks onto a different impossible defense, where a smaller force used the ground itself, not just its walls, to swallow an army whole. And I think it will change how you read every siege that came after it. And if you know someone who loves military history, the kind of person who has heard the 500 knights against 40,000 line a dozen times, but has never once been told what it actually cost to hold that rock, send them this video. They have heard the legend. Almost no one has been told the price. I will see you in the next one.